March 1978, Windham, New York. Police attend a car crash on a dark mountain road. Around 3:45 a.m, whilst they are still processing the scene, a car speeds towards them. One police officer gestures at the car to stop due to the accident, but the vehicle flies by, almost hitting him. Police chase after the car as it speeds away, and it only stops when it crashes into a telephone pole. The 17-year-old drunk driver tries to flee the scene, leaving the passenger, a 21-year-old woman, trapped in the wreckage with a broken leg. The driver doesn't get far before the police grab him and arrest him. His comment to the police officers is, "Next time, I won't get caught." The driver's name? Michael Skakel, a troubled boy from a prominent family who has recently been expelled from private school due to his behaviour spiralling out of control for the last few years. This accident is the final straw for his family and has far-reaching consequences for Michael. Unbeknownst to Michael, his family, or the police officers on duty, the repercussions that Michael faces for this collision will eventually help Greenwich Police solve the murder of Martha Moxley. Welcome to True Crime with Morty, a podcast by a criminologist and her dog. I am your host TJ, and this is Morty. Each week we'll be doing deep dives into murders and mysteries from all around the globe, using my background in law and criminology to give a full account of true crime stories. If that sounds good to you, please consider subscribing, and thank you for joining us today. This is episode 6 in the series Mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. In our last episode, we discussed how Martha's case was reopened in 1991, after public interest was renewed during the William Kennedy Smith trial. The cold case team consisted of Jack Solomon, who worked for State Attorney Donald Brown as an investigator, and Frank Garr, a homicide detective for 27 years, who was now also working at the State Attorney's office as an inspector. In 1992, Frank solved Martha's murder, but it would take another 10 years for it to go to trial, and almost as long for people to even listen to him about the identity of the murderer. In the meantime, another more infamous detective would get the credit. Frank Garr was a native of Greenwich, having moved there with his parents from Portchester, the son of hard-working Italian immigrants who ran their own restaurant and were part of a huge extended family. Frank had not known what to do after leaving school and had initially joined the army and been sent to Vietnam. While on leave, he had applied for the police force and joined Greenwich Police at 22 years old in 1967. He later married and raised a family in Glenville, Greenwich. His wife made him return to school and he gained a bachelor's degree. Frank made ends meet the way most cops in Greenwich do, driving around the rich and famous. His clients included Kathy Lee Gifford and her family. Kathy had also hired Frank as security to protect her children. In his early days in the Greenwich force, he became friends with Captain Keegan, and so when Keegan was put in charge of the detectives, he'd brought Frank in, and he was among the first detectives with an Italian heritage. He was very successful as a detective. He realised that drug use was the cause of most burglaries in Greenwich, and started the drug unit to combat the issue. He began working undercover using his passion for acting and his great people skills to gain the trust of drug dealers. By the end of the 90s, most of the detectives who'd worked on Martha's case were retired, and so as the last member of the team with a connection to the case, Frank had inherited it. Frank was very defensive of the original investigation. He fully supported his colleagues and did not take well to any outside criticism or interference, and he would not allow any more interference in the cold case investigation. He felt the case was solvable and believed that the intervening years would benefit his investigation rather than hinder it. First of all, DNA evidence was beginning to take off, and forensic science as a whole was developing so fast it was actually revolutionising investigations. It was possible that modern techniques could examine the evidence collected in 1975 and find the culprit. The other advantage in having 16 years between the murder and the cold case review was that many of the individuals involved were just children at the time Martha died, and now they were adults. Frank believed that maturity, perspective, wisdom would encourage people to come forward who perhaps would have been reluctant to speak to police back in 1975. He thought that either realisations about events or people that had occurred over the intervening years, or just their conscience nagging them about things they knew, would ensure that people came forward and spoke to him. The other advantage with cold cases is that suspects' behaviour since the crime can show whether they're living in fear or with guilty knowledge. In some cases, they offend again with related crimes, which gives police a clue, or at the very least, an opening to talk to them. The ones who have something to hide are usually nervous and are often in a state of distress, or just generally living in chaos. Often their story changes, and they are nervous during interviews or avoid the police entirely. Whereas innocent people who were suspects or witnesses in a cold case tend to be doing better when the police catch up to them, and are often happy to help because they know they have nothing to hide. These are general pointers, and of course they have exceptions, but you can imagine how someone who got away with a murder for 15 plus years may always be looking over their shoulder, and this could impact their day-to-day living and their choices. But an innocent person will simply move on and most likely welcome news that a resolution is coming. The final advantage is that sometimes in those intervening years, the killer confesses, and the person who has heard the confession may have no one to tell. They may have no idea who is dealing with this case or if their information is helpful. In some cases, they're not even sure what they've been told is true, if they don't know the case or the circumstances, or if the killer is vague on the details. So when a cold case reopens, it gives people who've heard confessions someone to contact, which is exactly what happened in Martha's case. However, cold cases do have many drawbacks. Witnesses and suspects pass away, the detectives and investigators retire and pass away. By the time Frank got the case, Martha's father David was gone, and Jeff Byrne, who had been with Martha the night she died, had also died in 1981, aged just 18. Many cold cases go cold due to lack of evidence of any kind, which means that any future forensic opportunities are unavailable, as there is simply nothing to test or potential evidence has degraded over time. And Frank had the added problem that there were two key suspects his predecessors had focused on, one of which would not speak to the police on advice of his family lawyers, which was the same family who were the last people to see Martha alive and also wouldn't communicate with police. So the only thing he could do was use the original case file, which had been kept locked in a box looked after by Captain Keegan with no one else having access to it. Using it as a, quote, encyclopedia, Frank studied it and began the investigation as if it was day one, as if Martha had literally just died, and go from there. Frank also had his tip line that was already generating calls. The tips were not about the main suspects, Tommy Skakel and Ken Littleton, but surrounded Michael Skakel. The tips were not declarations that Michael had killed Martha or was involved, but just talking about his behaviour back in 1975. The tips were largely about him being completely out of control. Speaking of the Skakel family, Frank Garr and Jack Solomon also had surprising news from the Skakels. In July 1991, during the media blitz on the Kennedys, just before the cold case review was announced to the public, Ashton Skakel Sr. invited them to his house for a meeting. He told them that in 1975 he had been scared for his children and had trusted the lawyers when they had advised him to avoid the investigation. However, he now felt sure that his children were not involved, that the attorneys had just scared him, and that they should now help the police with finding out what happened to Martha. Rushton said that he would contact his children and arrange meetings with Frank and Jack, which sounded ideal. They would either get their information to confirm it was a member of the Skakel household, or they could finally exonerate them and move on. But this goodwill lasted less than a day. The next morning, a call came in from Thomas Sheridan, who is the family lawyer, apart from Tommy, who has his own representation, and Sheridan told them that any contact with the family would come through him, not Rushton. Apparently, Sheridan had been called by Rushton's new wife after he'd told her about his meeting with the police. I find this so weird. It's like he's a child who has to be reined in, like he's a fully grown adult man and his children are grown adults. They may want to discuss their participation with a lawyer to understand their rights and the process of it all, but essentially they're just assisting with an investigation. They aren't minors who need protecting. They are at the very least witnesses, and it's kind of their duty to cooperate. So, once again, no cooperation from the Skakels. Frank returns to his case file. Martha's murder being in the spotlight had attracted the attention of celebrities in the field of investigation. In my last episode, I talked about how Vernon J. Giebreth, Lieutenant Commander of the NYPD and renowned investigator, had offered his expertise for the Matthew Margolis murder. He also contacted Greenwich to offer his help with Martha's case. The Detroit detectives had also offered to assist with the investigation again. But the help that Frank did accept was from the famous Dr. Henry Lee, who is known as the Godfather of Forensic Investigation and solved the woodchipper murder in Connecticut that the film Fargo was based on. As Dr. Lee is one of the most famous names and faces in investigation, I'll assume you know who he is, and I will be talking more about him in connection to other cases. But as a brief summary, Dr. Henry Lee started his career as a police officer in Taiwan and rose to captain at age 22. He moved to the United States in 1965, where he gained his PhD in biochemistry and moved into forensic investigation. He was director of Connecticut State Police Forensic Laboratory from 1978 to 2000 and Commissioner of Public Safety from 1998 to 2000. He then went on to Chief Emeritus for the Connecticut State Police from 2000 to 2010. Lee's work was so renowned, he was internationally known and was asked to work on or re-examine evidence of the most high-profile and notorious murder cases, like John Benet Ramsey. He joined O.J. Simpson's defence team and worked on the Michael Peterson and Danny Casolaro cases. He was also involved in the re-investigation of the assassination on John Kennedy and the forensic investigation of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He has even founded a college for forensic science and criminal justice in New Haven, Connecticut. Within the last few years, as of the time of recording, Dr. Henry Lee's methods and testimonies have been called into question after 2 men were exonerated for a crime they were sent to prison for, based on Dr. Lee giving false testimony at their trial. And they're not the only ones claiming that Dr. Henry Lee has given false testimony or presented faulty evidence. Now, I've not really looked into these claims at all. This feels a little bit like it's come out of left field, as this expose and the damages paid to the 2 men happened in the last few years. But up until then, there was kind of a general consensus that he was a genius, a wizard at forensics, at least to the public. For someone like me who has worked in the criminal justice field, was aware of who he was and aware there had been controversy, but there always is with expert witnesses, and as I don't specifically work in forensic science, I may not have clocked anything that he said was off. I studied forensic science a little bit when I was at uni, but I have very limited knowledge. Anyway, nowadays, Dr. Henry Lee has quite a confusing legacy that I will have to get into at some point. But in the 1990s, he was at the highest point of his fame, and he was considered the authority on forensic science, at least in some circles. Dr. Henry Lee joining the case was seen as a great advantage. If there was any forensic evidence, he would find it. He describes it as people assuming he has a crystal ball, that he will just know the answer to what they need. Now, these celebrities wanting to help is very interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, it means that despite Frank and Jack being the only people really working on this case, and the fact it's been a cold case, which can at times be a disadvantage, they had significant offers of help from respected and experienced people, as well as some resources to throw at the case. The investigation was happening and had the best chance of progress being made. It was not dead, it was not struggling, it had a full-on reboot. Secondly, Dr. Henry Lee having such a stellar reputation at this time in history would put serious fear into Martha's killer. You have a team reinvestigating it, a more experienced team, with celebrity help. You have public interest, which creates pressure for results. And forensic science has progressed significantly at this point, with Dr. Henry Lee reviewing what was available for Martha's case. In short, anyone who was involved in the killing of Martha or a cover-up of what happened was going to panic. It's like playing poker. At this point, the police were looking for someone to blink. The Skakels didn't just blink. It was more like their heads spun round, like the girl in The Exorcist, and the green vomit come flying out. In an almost unprecedented panic move, the Skakels spent $1 million on their own investigation. Rushton Skakel Sr. hired Sutton Associates, a team of extremely pricey private investigators run by former FBI agent Jim Murphy. He wanted them to do an investigation into Martha's murder and find out what really happened and whether any of his kids could be implicated in it. The mandate was that no arrests had been made, that his child had remained a suspect, and he wanted them to evaluate and analyse the evidence available. On the face of it, this seems like a generous and altruistic move to help find Martha's killer. But it doesn't make sense. Martha's case had been cold for 16 years, and now that people are finally reinvestigating it in 1991, Rushton spends $1 million of his own money to find the culprit in 1992 when the cold case is barely started. Why now? Why not in the previous 16 years? And I must point out that he did this in 1992, after his 1991 meeting with police where he was saying his family was an open book and that they just needed to talk to the kids. And literally a day later, his attorney shut the whole thing down. If he really wanted Martha's case resolved and his child exonerated, the simplest thing to do would be to insist his family fully cooperate with the police. Lawyers be damned. Or maybe just use them as legal representation rather than a barrier. Not spend $1 million on his own investigation. You have to ask yourself, would you do this? If your neighbour had been murdered and your children may well be questioned or even suspects in the case, but you believed that they were innocent, would you spend this money having the case reinvestigated less than 6 months after a high-profile cold case team had begun to review it? It's nonsense, right? So why did he do this? Well, the investigation was less about finding out what really happened to Martha and more of a fact-finding mission to discover what evidence the police had. Were any of his children implicated? What evidence was against them? This would enable him to build a comprehensive defence if anyone was formally charged in connection with Martha's case. They would have time to work with defence attorneys on the best strategy to refute the evidence presented. It was not altruistic at all. It was entirely self-serving. Because the real agenda was about proving it was Ken Littleton. Aside from ensuring his children would be acquitted or protected from this, Rushton had also instructed the Sutton Associates to try and prove that the real culprit was Ken Littleton. To say this backfired on Rushton Skakel, it could not have gone worse for him. It is time to bring back Len Levitt, who, if you remember, was the investigative journalist who did a big article on Martha's case, only to have it prevented from being published out of fear it would offend Skakels. It was finally published in June 1991 and was very well received by everyone. Which is why he was contacted in 1992 by the Sutton Associates. Murphy wanted to offer Len the opportunity for an inside scoop of their investigation for a follow-up article on Martha, in exchange for a copy of the police report he had obtained and used for his own research. Murphy told him that they were doing a deep dive into the theory that Ken Littleton was a serial killer and that Martha was one of his victims. I don't just mean see what evidence, if any, connected Ken to the crime. It was more than that. It was to make him look as guilty as possible by trying to connect everything and anything back to him and digging up whatever dirt they could. So when they told Len about the deep dive on Ken, Len was pretty sceptical about that. He was happy to hand over the report for more information, but by his understanding of the case that the police had compiled and his own perspective on the evidence, he was certain that the Associates would discover that Tommy was the killer, which he was sure was not the intention of Rushton Skakel. Did it seem likely that the Sutton Associates would complete an investigation on behalf of Rushton, and if finding the culprit to be Tommy, as Len suspected that they would then publicise the information that their client's son was the killer and give the information to people like Len? No way. So Len asked what would happen if the investigation pointed back to the Skakels. Murphy insisted that Rushton wanted the truth, whatever that was, and would cooperate fully with the police if that was the case. But he hinted to Len that they were very confident that it would be Ken Littleton that would be found guilty. Assuming that they knew something that he didn't, Len shrugged it off and handed over the file to Sutton Associates, excited for what information may come out of this, and hopeful that somewhere between the police investigation and the private investigators, the case would be solved and the Moxley family would get resolution and justice. He didn't hear anything back for a few years. He met with Murphy a few times in the interim, but the scoop didn't come in. He would get his scoop eventually. They hadn't forgotten about him. It was just their investigation was becoming a disaster for the Skakels. The Sutton Associates began their investigation in 1992 and carried on until roughly 1995. They looked at all the evidence they could in relation to Ken Littleton, but they also interviewed the Skakel family and collected background information on all the key people in the case. They discussed the new police investigation and said that Dr. Lee was assisting the cold case team. On learning that Dr. Henry Lee was looking for forensic evidence for the cold case team, suddenly Thomas and Michael Skakel changed their stories about what happened the night Martha died. Yeah. Here is what they said. So let's start with Tommy. As you may remember, in his original version of events, he had told police that he had left Martha at 9:30 p.m, where he returned to his house and handed Andrea Shakespeare the keys to Julie's car. Once inside, he worked on a report for school, which the police had discovered was non-existent. and spent some time with Ken Littleton at around 10:20, which Ken had in fact confirmed. Martha, meanwhile, had headed home at 9:30, and Tommy had no idea what happened to her after that. His new story to the Sutton Associates was that he lied in 1975. He had left Martha to go back in the house at 9:30, as originally stated, but after giving Andrea the keys, he'd gone back outside and spent more time with Martha. He told the investigators that he and Martha had had sex, and then he'd left her to go home and went back inside at 9:50 p.m. Martha walked home and he didn't see her after that. The investigators were aware that Martha was a virgin from her autopsy reports, so this idea that she'd had sex with Tommy was clearly Tommy lying, and they tell him this. So he corrects his statement by saying that by sex he did not mean intercourse, he was referring to, quote, mutual masturbation. During this interview, Tommy, who at this point is around 33 years old, breaks down and starts crying. He says that he lied at the time because of his strict father being horrified by the very idea of his children being sexually active. One of the investigators, Murphy, believes that Tommy's about to confess to killing Martha, that this breakdown, these tears, is less to do with a grown man embarrassed to talk about sex or related activities, and more to do with him finally coming clean about what really happened to Martha. But at that point, Thomas Sheridan, the Skakel family lawyer, suggests a break, and he removes Tommy from the interview. So, the issues with this, where do we start? First of all, Tommy has changed his story multiple times, seemingly to account for the possibility his semen or similar evidence are being found at the scene. The scenario has changed from, in 1975, him saying that she went home after a quick chat at the door, and it was contradicting reports from others that they were making out. He completely denied that. Then in the 1980s, he's speaking to Len Levitt. He acts like he hardly knows Martha and has no memory of any of this at all. And now, in the 1990s, he remembers a whole new story saying he lied about sexual interaction because he was scared and what his dad would think. But then he says sex and is challenged on that because of her autopsy confirming that she had not done that before. And so he changes the encounter to masturbation. It's very clear that he's covering up something, but can we honestly believe any of these versions of what happened? He has confidently lied for over 16 years to detectives and other interested parties, and he's even fooled a lie detector. This is very impressive for someone who has been described as slow and vulnerable. Another issue with his changing statements is the time that he said Martha left. Even if he was not comfortable telling the police, or even people like Len Levitt, the truth of what he and Martha were doing, why did he lie to police about the time Martha left the house? Why did that matter? He simply could have said that he and Martha were talking or hanging out until 9:50, but instead he screwed up the timeline of the case and now puts himself with Martha at the time police feel it's most likely that she died. What's even worse than that for Tommy is that when Dorothy Moxley called the Skakel house at 1:30 a.m. on Halloween morning, which was almost 12 hours before Martha was found dead, Tommy had told her that Martha had left at 9:30 p.m, not 9:50. Now, if he felt he had to change the time to the police during his interview because he was worried about admitting the sexual encounter, which still looks suspicious, but let's try and give him the benefit of the doubt on that one, why did he lie at 1:30 a.m. to Dorothy? Why not say when Martha actually left rather than 20 minutes earlier? It almost indicates knowledge about what happened to Martha and him trying to distance himself from what happened to her by saying she left earlier in the evening, and this is of course hours before anyone knows something bad's happened to her. So to sum up, Tommy has lied to everyone consistently for 16 years, and potentially this is still not the full truth, this version he's told Sutton Associates. These lies are serious. The changing of the time and covering up a sexual interaction with Martha, that could be linked to him having involvement or knowledge of the crime. And at the very least, if he's innocent, it's still messed up the timeline for police when they're looking at other suspects. And if you think Tommy's sudden changes are alarming, then wait till you hear what Michael told Sutton Associates. Back in 1975, Michael had told police that he'd been with Martha in the Lincoln car and that he'd asked her to come with him to the Terrians to watch Monty Python and have a drink and a smoke. She'd declined, saying she had to go home. Michael had left Belle Haven at around 9:20 p.m. in the Lincoln car to go to the Terrians' estate on Cliffdale Road. He remained there with his brothers and cousin before returning home to Belle Haven at 11:20, where he went straight to bed. This alibi had been confirmed by two of his brothers and Jimmy Terrian, as they had all departed together and then the Skakel boys had returned home together. Despite Michael being a perfect match for almost every profile done on the killer, and having a history of violence and reckless behaviour, as well as being the Skakel boy known to have a crush on Martha, this information, his whereabouts at the time, corroborated by three others, had been enough to discount him from the original police investigation. The police felt that although Michael would have been a perfect suspect, he simply wasn't there when Martha died. Case closed. So imagine the shock of the Sutton Associates when, during their interview with Michael on the 4th of August 1992, at Thomas Sheridan's house, he tells them that he went out again at 11:40 p.m. His destination? The Moxley property, to see Martha. Now, there is a more detailed version of this story, which I will get to later, as he tells someone else an expanded version. In fact, Michael tells several versions of this story. It's a bit like that film Clue. But in the Sutton report, Michael states that he decides to leave the house to go see Martha, and around midnight he climbed a tree outside Martha's window and was throwing stones at it and shouting her name. I don't believe this, as by 11 p.m, Dorothy is waiting for Martha to come home. She is on alert for noises, and I think that even with the size of the property, she would have noticed this and could confirm his story. Just my personal opinion, but I did not believe that at all. He then says that he decides to masturbate in the tree outside Martha's window. I mean, obviously, who hasn't done that? We all go to our crush's house in high school and masturbate in trees. That's a universal experience. As the young people would say, he's so real for that. The tree masturbator comes to his senses, no pun intended, and quickly climbs down the tree before someone sees him. He heads back to Walsh Lane and comes to a stop under a streetlight where he, quote, senses a presence in the direction of where Martha's body is later found. He yells into the darkness and throws something, bearing in mind he has no clue at this point that Martha is dead, or what lurks under that tree, but he has some sort of sixth sense of danger and he yells out and throws rocks before running home. Okay. He gets home and everyone's asleep, so the door is locked and he climbs through a window and goes to bed himself. As I said earlier, there's a longer, more detailed version of this story, but obviously even this shorter version is a complete shocking U-turn, and like Tommy's story, is clearly not true, or at least not the full truth. There is a sensory realism to what he's saying, as if he was there that night, but essentially his story just doesn't add up. First of all, why mention any of this? In 1975, he said he went straight to bed at 11:20, and the police believed him. Why now tell the Sutton Associates that he was wandering through the crime scene, especially around 2 hours after police believe Martha died? If he didn't kill Martha and he didn't witness anything relevant to the crime, then his wandering is irrelevant, and changing his story at this point, unprompted, looks really bad. It seems to me that, like his brother, he's trying to account for his DNA being at the scene, which looks very suspicious. Secondly, by 11 p.m, Dorothy Moxley is wondering where her daughter is. As I said earlier, any noise in the garden after that point is going to get her attention. If Michael is there at midnight, that is directly between 11 p.m, where she begins to worry, and 1 a.m, where she begins to make phone calls. I honestly think that she would have either heard that or seen him, or even if this was when she nodded off by the window, she would have been woken up by it. The Moxleys had a large property, but Dorothy was a worried mum, sat by the front door waiting for her child. I don't think that she would have missed him coming in and making so much noise. Third, his new version, or rather the more detailed account of it he tells later on, places him at every part of the murder scene, from the place that Martha was first attacked all the way through to the tree where she was eventually found. What are the chances that Martha is murdered in her garden, that she's hit, she runs, she's attacked again, and then moved finally under a tree for concealment, and then what, an hour or two later, her friend wanders into the garden and goes to every single place this attack happened and then masturbates in a tree close to the murder site? He also wanders through the crime scene and, quote, feels a presence but doesn't find Martha, nor does his shenanigans disturb her anxious mother or her brother sleeping upstairs. I mean, is Michael Skakel just the most unlucky person on the planet? What are the odds of all this happening? Him wandering through a crime scene an hour later and not realising. Like, dude, seriously, how high were you? So again, this version just feels like an attempt to account for any forensic link between him and the crime scene, for defence purposes, to protect himself from prosecution. Just like his brother, we are not being told the truth, we are being told like a quasi-true account to cover their tracks. So you can imagine how this looked to seasoned investigators. As Timothy Dumas, author of Greentown, said, quote, "The Skakels did this to themselves." I agree. If they didn't kill Martha, then they have put themselves on the hook for it with all this deception and absurd behaviour, constant pathological lying to the police, and then saying all of this new version to the Sutton Associates, changing their stories in such a dramatic and nonsensical way. And the Sutton report, it only got worse for Michael. The investigators got their hands on the assessments done by Dr. Bloomingdale back when Michael was 10. If you recall from the previous episode, the assessment done on Tommy and Michael was pretty damning. They were both described as having impulsive behaviour, poor ego development, bad self-image, sexually immature, emotionally blocked. They both had alcohol and drug problems, they were lost, disorganised, but also likeable and athletic, so that is something good to hold on to, I guess. But this assessment highlighted a key difference between Tommy and Michael, and that was that Tommy felt loved by his family and Michael did not. The assessment seems to confirm that Michael may have experienced some distance from his family. Apparently, Julie was, quote, frightened of Michael. Obviously, Michael feeling unloved may have been a genuine response to how he was treated, but we can't say for sure how his family felt about him. Julie saying she was afraid does not mean she didn't care about him or distance herself, but it could indicate that Michael's behaviour affected family dynamics, hence the need for the assessment. And as a 10-year-old boy, he may not connect his actions and how they were affecting those around him, making any sort of rejection or being reprimanded as seeming like they didn't care or, quote, didn't love him when they were just responding to his behaviour. What is concerning is that much of this is repeated when, as an adult, he would describe his childhood in detail, and amongst the insane amount of privilege mentioned are some horrific allegations about how he was treated and what was going on in the Skakel home. It is tough to corroborate what he says, and in view of his lack of honesty in other aspects of this case, it would be easy to see this as a deflection for his own behaviour. Feel sorry for me, I had such a tough time in the mansion. But sadly, it would fit well with the type of problems we see in the lives of offenders. Addiction, abuse, violence, trauma, they're all very common in offender backgrounds and were clearly present in the Skakel household. Almost everyone who hears that Tommy and Michael have changed their stories agree that this isn't about finally coming clean, as they're obviously still lying. It's believed that this was more about defending why their DNA is at a murder scene. Should Dr. Henry Lee or anyone else find evidence linking them to the scene, using modern forensic techniques, then it was the result of this masturbation. It was no big deal. It didn't mean that they killed her. Okay. While Sutton Associates are continuing their investigation through the early 90s, another person is honing in on the Skakels. In 1993, a famous author releases a novel based on Martha's murder. Although it is a work of fiction, it seems more like journalism, a true crime book dressed as a novel. The author makes it clear that they believe a Skakel killed Martha and proceeds to repeat this idea on talk shows and in other publishing events. But which Skakel? And how does this person have the inside scoop of the case? Find out in our next episode on the mystery on Walsh Lane, the Martha Moxley murder. Thank you for listening to True Crime with Morty. Please like, comment and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Goodbye from me, and goodbye from Morty.